All right, everybody. Hope you're doing well. That was 787. I'll explain what we're doing here today. We're going to talk about shooting on the move, which I just didn't really do a whole lot of, and I'll explain why here in a second. But shooting on the move is something I get a ton of questions about, how to train for, how to get better at it. And so I'm going to try to explain some of those things here today. But the first thing I always kind of have to explain is why. Why is shooting on the move important? This is a similar setup to an exercise that we do in class to test why shooting on the move makes sense. Obviously, in a defensive or tactical environment, the reasons are numerous. I don't have to explain them to you. Just watch any video of CQB or room clearing and you'll see a whole lot of shooting the move going on, right? But obviously also be creating space, moving to and from cover, etc., right? Lots of reasons to shoot on the move. In a practical environment, maybe we're doing a USPSA match, something similar, people always obviously feel less comfortable shooting on the move because it's more difficult. And there's that feeling of, hey, I could just stand here and shoot really fast and then run over there and shoot really fast some more. And that'll be faster than maybe I have to shoot slower if I try to do it all on the move. And so we kind of compare those times and see which one is faster. What I tried to do there is shoot really aggressively. Didn't even really guarantee my hits. Honestly, I was shooting more aggressively than I probably would in a match. Tried to move really aggressively, see what my time was. That was a 787. Let's try it on the move now, see what we come up with. Okay, here we go. All right, so that was a 578. I don't remember the first time exactly. You guys will have it. It was 7 something. So I basically just saved 7 seconds there. Now what I try to do on that demo is not shoot super fast. Nice and casual, controlled, guaranteeing each and every hit as much as I possibly can as I go through that movement. Because the way I like to think about it is that shooting on the move actually buys you time to be more careful. This is one of the few opportunities we have in shooting where we can actually get faster, i.e. reduce the total amount of time that we took, and get actually more accurate at the same time. Now look, there's a lot of variables that go into this: target difficulty, how far you have to move, so on and so forth. I do have a couple partial targets here, but due to the size of the bay that I'm on, even that headshot's only at 7 yards, which isn't super difficult to shoot on the move. So we have, obviously a setup here that lends itself towards that skill set. Well, depending on the array or the stage that you're on, that formula is obviously going to change a little bit. So the only way you can really educate yourself on when it makes sense to shoot on the move versus when it doesn't is, first of all, build that skill set up, but then go out and try exercises like this multiple different ways and see which way works out best for you. Okay, so with that said, let's now talk about on those applications where it does absolutely make sense to shoot on the move. What are some techniques that can help you be more successful? I like to say that there's 2 component skills to being really good to shooting at the move. One is simply moving in such a way that as you move, you're able to keep your sights as still as possible while you're moving. Obviously, the thing about shooting on the move that's more difficult is as I'm walking, I'm going to be introducing some movement into the sights from the walking process, from those impacts of the footfalls hitting the ground. And so if I can figure out how to move in such a way that it softens that, and I can keep my sights more still, that's obviously going to make things easier. The part of the step that influences usually the most impact into the sights, the most movement, is the impact of that foot into the ground, because it's arresting the momentum of that movement. As I kind of go forward, you can obviously imagine if I kind of stiff leg this out and impacted, that's going to cause that big dip to happen in the sights. And so I want to soften that as much as I can. There's a few ways that I can do that. Number one, I want to introduce some spring suspension in there, right? Instead of just sort of having, the wheels on my car welded to the chassis with no give, that'd be a really rough ride. I want those shock absorbers in there. For our walking process, shock absorbers are going to be your knees. So if I can lower my center of gravity and actually flex those knees a little bit, and instead of impacting roughly, I can bend the knees to sort of smooth out that impact, it's going to do a lot for stabilizing those sights as I move. A lot of folks are very comfortable shooting in a very upright, tall stance with the legs locked out. This makes shooting on the move more difficult as you reach out and that foot kind of impacts. If you get more comfortable shooting with knees bent, a wide stance, your shooting on the move will be a lot more successful. So that's just kind of a side tip there. But bend the knees, soften that impact. Again, also the way that your feet hit the ground. So if I kind of plop the foot down all at once, that's an abrupt impact, versus if I roll step by touching with the heel and then rolling through that impact. Both of those things together are going to smooth out the impact of those footfalls. A couple other quick tips for folks that get too wide sometimes. What I generally see is that as you step, that causes some side-to-side sway. So if you're seeing that side-to-side sway, look out for that. Also the kind of direction of your feet. If I'm used to standing sort of crowfoot, if you will, with my toes pointing out, when my heel impacts and I roll through that step, it's going to bring me that way, versus when it impacts and I roll through, it's going to bring me that way. So in a situation where I'm walking straight towards the target, what I'm looking out for in my diagnostics is, am I seeing any side-to-side movement in the dot as I move? If so, a couple of those things are probably at fault there. Pay attention and clean those up. When it comes to moving sort of in width, so that's moving directly toward the target. If I'm moving now across the range while shooting this way, are things any different? One of the questions that I get pretty often is about crossing your feet, right? For me, I pay less attention to these kind of hard and fast rules that folks come up with, like never cross your feet. Obviously, if I'm doing something, that looks like this, and I'm getting tied up in my feet, that's obviously not a good thing. I want to pay some attention there. But look at this, from your perspective in the camera right now, if I walk directly perpendicular to the camera and I walk like this, you'll see that one foot, the feet are passing each other as I go, right? If I do the exact same thing while looking that way, am I crossing my feet or am I just walking? Same thing goes now if I act like the camera is actually a target and I shoot on the move. Are my feet crossing each other? Absolutely, but really all that's happening is I'm just walking that way while I'm shooting this way. For most folks, we've been walking on this earth for quite a while now. It's not that difficult. That's not going to be a real challenge. If it's a challenge for you, well then figure out a technique that does work. But for me, you're absolutely going to see me crossing my feet in that fashion as I shoot on the move, okay? One tip that I have for shooting in width. As much as possible, what I like to do is keep my sort of structure behind the gun, which is primarily from the waist up, the same. What I don't want to do is say I'm walking this way, right? And this would be my normal shooting stance. The way that I'm going to bring the gun over here is not going to be twisting. It's not going to be breaking my arms down or anything like that. It's going to be pivoting on my knees and with my hips, trying to keep the structure behind the gun the same as much as possible from the waist up. Now, where I run into an issue, again, if the camera's my target now, as I start getting past my target, if this is my normal shooting stance, I can only pivot so far to my left with the gun before I sort of get bound up, and the only way I can go farther is, again, to break that structure. Versus if I get out of my normal shooting stance, I'm gonna do the exact same thing. I'm gonna go exactly where that bind point is, and the only chance I'm gonna make here, hopefully you can see, yes, my feet, is to take my left toe and pivot it around. You'll see that it gives me several more degrees there that I can pivot without sacrificing structure. So what I would typically do is when I'm moving in width, shooting downrange, is I will keep whatever foot is further away from the target pointed in my direction of travel. Whichever foot is closer to the target will be pointed at the target. So sort of like this, and just a nice wide stance. Every time I step this way, I got a nice roll step, right? This is leaving my hips open to the target so that I can shoot, coming across, and I'm sort of still rolling, but I have to kind of roll on the blade of the foot through to the other edge now. It's not quite as nice as that heel to toe roll because I have less surface area to play with, but it's the exact same concept. And now what I can do is as I come across this target, I can just pivot around as much as possible, I'm still gonna run into a situation eventually where it's difficult to turn farther. In the event that I know where I'm going, I'm not worried about running into stuff over here, the easy solution to do now is to simply come around and reverse orientation as I continue moving in the direction that I have to go to. That's gonna free up my angles to pivot onto that target. Now, that's kind of component number one. How do we move in such a way that our sights stay as still as possible while we're shooting on the move? The second component is essentially understanding that there is gonna still be movement left over. We're never gonna neutralize all that movement. Our sights are still gonna be moving a little bit as we're walking. And so we have to learn to accept that leftover movement and time it where we get the gun to go off right as the sights are acceptably on target. There's two things that I think are gonna be really important here. Number one is your visual discipline. You have to leave your eyes locked on to a small spot on the target where you wanna hit. If you start following your hands or following your dot, sort of looking at the dot as it bounces around the target, then what's gonna happen is you're gonna lose a lot of focus on where exactly on the target it is that you wanna hit, and you're just following that dot. And kind of as soon as you see brown behind that dot, you're probably gonna start sending rounds, and you're gonna be getting Charlies and Deltas and even Mikes on occasion because you're not paying attention to a small spot on the target where you wanna hit. Vision's absolutely huge here. The other thing that I would pay a lot of attention to is your trigger work. So we're most likely shooting a little bit more carefully, which is gonna take a little bit longer when we're shooting on the move. This buys us time to be more careful on the trigger. This, to me, is where trigger prep is really important. I have time to prep the trigger. It's gonna allow me to press the trigger faster once I get permission to do it from the sights, and it's gonna disturb the gun less. So instead of just kind of chilling around with my finger out towards the front of the trigger guard, and as soon as I see that dot come through, I now have to snatch all the way through it, I'll be sitting here looking at the target with that trigger fully prepped, and this way, as soon as I see that dot where I want it, I just touch off that remaining ounce or two of pressure on that trigger, and the round is gonna go right where I want it. Practicing these two things, there is absolutely no magic system for this. One of the questions that I get very, very regularly whenever I do AMAs on Instagram or other social media is, hey man, what drills should I be doing to get better at shooting on the move? There is no drill. There is no magic layout. There is no exact procedure that you should follow to get better at shooting on the move, guys. Practice skills, not drills. What do I mean by that? If you want to get better at shooting on the move, what you should probably do is go to the range and set up some targets and shoot them while moving and work on doing that better. That's really all it is. There is no, hey man, I want you to put a target at 3 and 15 and 17 with a 5-yard separation, then a piece of steel over here. That may be a fine array to work on, but it has nothing to do with specifically making you better at shooting on the move. You just have to work on shooting on the move and get better at that. And where your strengths and weaknesses are is gonna influence what you should be working on. As an example, maybe for me, I could do this all day and I'm never gonna miss an alpha. This isn't really stressing me out too much, right? So I should probably not be shooting on the move targets that are this close. I should probably be pushing them out to like 15, 20 yards trying to do that, right? If you're just getting started with this, maybe you need targets closer, like 3-yard open targets, no partials. Like start there. Once you're getting comfortable with that, then push them out, right? So depending on where your skill set is, you should be adjusting things. Try shooting paper, try shooting steel, do all the things on the move and work on getting better at it. With that said, you should practice the two components, I think, separately, especially when you're getting started. So to start with, you can practice component one, i.e. keeping the sights still without ever touching the trigger. Touching the trigger is going to distract you from things. You also need to be doing a bunch of transitions. So as an example, if I want to just figure out how to move in such a way that my sights are more quiet, what I can do is set up one target like this or a light switch in your house or whatever it is. And in dry fire, guys, I can just start back here. And all I'm going to do is draw the pistol and watch my dot on target as I move and see how still I can keep it while I move on that target. Then I'll work on some angles. Then I'll work on some shooting in width, that sort of thing, right? Just practicing that first component of watching my sights on target, paying attention to how they're moving and trying to quiet them down by changing how low I'm getting in my center of gravity, how far apart my steps are, how my feet are hitting the ground, all those kind of things I'm paying attention to as I move around. Then we can start working in component 2, which is timing those shots when your sights are acceptably, in fact, right where you want them on target, and seeing what you can get away with. You can absolutely do this in dry fire. I work on a lot of movement stuff in dry fire. However, it's difficult for a lot of people when they first start to have an idea of what you can get away with. i.e., as your gun comes across the target in dry fire and you go bam, it's really hard for folks to understand exactly where was the gun when it went off, and therefore where did that shot go. So when you're first starting off, it will require some ammo to be burned, most likely. In live fire, as you start practicing component 2 there, timing those shots to figure out what your sight package actually needs to look like on targets of varying difficulty, what you can get away with, right? So definitely do some work on that in live fire, and then you can spend a lot of time in dry fire kind of combining those two concepts together of keeping your sights as still as possible and then timing those shots to happen when your sights are in an optimal position. Hopefully this was some helpful tips for you today, guys, on shooting on the move. Shooting on the move is not that complex. You just gotta walk in such a way that your sights are careful and then learn to time those shots to happen when your sights are actually on target. Simple concept, doesn't mean it's easy, takes a lot of work to master. And so if you're not already, I highly encourage you to work in some of this kind of training into your practice. I think it'll pay dividends for your performance. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.